The Montana sun hung low over Miller Creek Ranch, painting the eastern hills in shades of copper and rust. Dust devils danced across the main paddock where 3 young geldings kicked up their heels, but the northernmost enclosure remained still as a photograph. Just one horse standing motionless against the far fence line, a paint stallion with a coat like spilled ink on cream. Lucy Miller sat cross-legged atop a hay bale near the equipment shed, her scuffed cowboy boots dangling, watching that distant horse with the intensity only a lonely 10-year-old could muster. The afternoon heat made the air shimmer, but she'd grown used to the discomfort. Since her mother's death 3 years ago, she'd spent most afternoons out here, preferring the honest company of animals to the awkward sympathy of adults. "Girl, what did I tell you about staring at that devil horse?" Old Sam's voice cut through her reverie like a dull blade. He stood 20 feet away, one boot propped on a fence rail, rolling a cigarette with weathered hands that had seen 60-some Montana winters. His face was the color of saddle leather, creased deep with lines that told stories he never shared. There was something in his dark eyes, Cherokee, some said, though Lucy had heard her Aunt Sarah whisper Crow once, that always seemed to be looking at something just beyond what everyone else could see. "I'm not staring," Lucy said, which was a lie. "I'm just sitting." Sam lit his cigarette, the smoke curling up into the still air. "You're sitting while looking directly at the one thing on this whole ranch you got no business looking at." Lucy pulled at a strand of hay. "Daddy says he's just a horse. Your daddy's a practical man. Practical men don't always see what's there." Sam took a long drag. "That paint's been here 7 years. 7 years, and not one person's managed to get a saddle on him without something going wrong. You know what happened to Jake Morrison, don't you?" Everyone knew about Jake Morrison. He'd been Montana's best horse trainer, a man who could gentle wild mustangs with patience and a soft voice. He'd driven up from Billings specifically to work with the paint, confident he could break what others couldn't. 3 hours into the first session, he dropped dead of a heart attack right there in the round pen. The paint had been standing over him when they found them both. Jake sprawled in the dirt, and the horse with his head lowered, perfectly still, like he was standing vigil. "Daddy says Mr. Morrison had a bad heart. The doctors said so." "Doctors?" Sam spat into the dust. "Doctors don't know everything. That horse has got something old in him, something that don't take kindly to ropes and bridles. My people used to talk about spirits that could move between worlds, take up residence where they didn't belong. That paint's got the eyes of something that's lived more than one life." Lucy had heard versions of this story from every ranch hand who'd worked at Miller Creek. Each telling added new embellishments. The paint's eyes glowed red at night. He could sense fear from 100 yards away. Crows followed him like harbingers of death. She'd even heard young Tommy Barnes swear he'd seen the horse standing outside his bedroom window one night, 3 miles from the ranch, though Tommy was known for sampling his daddy's whiskey. But when Lucy looked at the paint now, standing alone against the far fence with his head turned toward the distant Beartooth Mountains, she didn't see a devil. She saw loneliness. She saw the same expression she'd caught in the bathroom mirror that morning while braiding her hair. The look of someone trying to remember something important, something just out of reach. "Sam," Lucy ventured, "have you ever actually talked to him? The paint, I mean." The old man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, something flickered across his weathered face. Recognition? Fear? Guilt? Then it was gone, replaced by his usual stoic mask. "I don't talk to cursed things," he said flatly. "And neither should you. Your daddy's finally doing the right thing, getting rid of that animal tomorrow. Should have done it years ago, the day after Morrison died." Lucy's head snapped up. "Getting rid of him? What do you mean?" Sam looked like he'd said more than he intended. He took another drag of his cigarette, studying the horizon. "Nothing for you to worry about, little girl. Ranch business." But Lucy was already sliding off the hay bale, her heart suddenly pounding. "Sam, what do you mean getting rid of him?" The old cowboy sighed, grinding his cigarette out under his boot heel. "Meat buyers are coming tomorrow morning. Your daddy's selling the paint to a processing plant in Great Falls. Horse like that, no good for riding, eating up feed and space. It's just good business." The words hit Lucy like a physical blow. She looked back toward the North Paddock, toward that solitary figure standing against the fence. The paint had turned now, and even from 200 yards away, Lucy could swear those dark eyes were looking directly at her. "He can't," Lucy whispered. Daddy can't do that. He can and he will, Sam said, not unkindly. Sometimes you gotta cut your losses, girl. That's ranching. But even as he spoke, Sam was staring at the paint too, and his expression held something Lucy had never seen there before. It looked almost like shame. The dinner bell clanged from the main house. Aunt Sarah signaled that supper was ready. Sam tipped his hat and headed toward the bunkhouse, but Lucy remained frozen, watching the paint. The horse hadn't moved. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. Tomorrow morning. They were coming tomorrow morning. Lucy made a decision then. One she knew her father would call foolish and her aunt would call downright dangerous. As the sun began its final descent behind the western ridgeline, casting long shadows across the Montana grassland, she started walking toward the North Paddock. Behind her, unnoticed, old Sam stopped and turned. He watched the small figure of Chuck Miller's daughter making her way toward the devil horse, and his weathered face crumpled into an expression of such profound sorrow that it would have broken anyone's heart to see it. "I'm sorry, Uncle," he whispered to the wind. "I'm sorry for all of it." Then he turned and walked away, his shadow stretching long across the dust. The North Paddock fence was older than Lucy, weathered wood that had gone silver gray under decades of sun and snow. Wild roses grew along its base, their thorns catching at her jeans as she approached. The paint stood about 30 feet away, perfectly still except for the occasional flick of his tail against the evening flies. Lucy had never been this close before. Sam's warnings, her father's strict orders, the weight of Jake Morrison's death, all of it had kept her at a distance. But now, with less than 12 hours before the meat buyers arrived, those warnings seemed less important than the certainty growing in her chest that this was wrong. All of it was wrong. "Hey," she said softly, gripping the top rail of the fence. "Hey, boy." The paint's ears swiveled toward her voice, but he didn't move. Up close, he was bigger than she'd realized, probably 16 hands, with powerful shoulders and legs built for endurance rather than speed. His coat was remarkable, a patchwork of white and liver chestnut that some called Tobiano, but it was his eyes that held her attention. They were the deepest brown, almost black, and they held an intelligence that made Lucy's breath catch. These weren't the eyes of a wild animal, or even a particularly smart horse. These were eyes that seemed to understand not just commands or threats, but meaning itself. "They're going to take you away tomorrow," Lucy said, her voice cracking slightly. "Did you know that? Is that why you're looking at the mountains? Are you thinking about running?" The paint took 3 slow steps toward her, then stopped. His nostrils flared, scenting the air. Lucy held perfectly still, remembering what her grandfather had taught her before he died. Never make sudden movements around horses. Let them come to you. Let them decide you're safe. "I don't think you're cursed," she continued, speaking as much to calm herself as to communicate with the horse. "I don't think you killed Mr. Morrison. I think maybe you're just sad. Maybe you're stuck here, and you can't tell anyone why." Another step closer. The paint's head lowered slightly, his ears forward in what her grandfather had called the listening position. The setting sun caught the white patches on his face, making him look almost ethereal. "I'm sad too sometimes," Lucy whispered. "About Mom. Everyone thinks I'm too young to really understand, but I do. I miss her so much it feels like my chest has a hole in it. Aunt Sarah tries to help, but she's not Mom. And Daddy works all the time now. I think he's sad too, but he doesn't talk about it. Cowboys don't talk about being sad." The paint was at the fence now, just 3 feet away. This close, Lucy could see the small details, a white sock on his left hind leg, a small scar above his right eye, the gray hairs just beginning to show around his muzzle. He wasn't young, she realized. Maybe 12 or 13 years old, getting to that age where horses started to slow down, started to look back on their lives the way humans did. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, Lucy reached out her hand. She didn't try to touch him. That would have been too presumptuous, but she offered her open palm, letting him decide. The paint studied her hand for a long moment. Then, with a gentleness that completely contradicted every story ever told about him, he stretched his neck forward and touched his muzzle to her palm. His breath was warm and smelled of grass. His whiskers tickled her skin. Lucy felt tears spring to her eyes. "You're not mean at all," she breathed. "You're just lonely, aren't you? Stuck out here by yourself, and everyone's afraid of you, and you can't tell them they're wrong." The paint huffed softly, and then did something that sent a shiver down Lucy's spine. He turned his head, deliberately, and looked not at her but past her, toward the main house. Specifically, toward the second-story window of her grandfather's old study, the room her father kept locked and hadn't entered since the funeral. Lucy followed his gaze. Grandpa Phil's room? What about it? The paint snorted, tossing his head slightly, then looked back at her with those impossibly knowing eyes. Then he looked at the window again, more insistently. You want me to go there? Lucy asked, feeling slightly foolish for having a conversation with a horse. But the paint bobbed his head, once, twice, in a manner that seemed far too deliberate to be coincidental. A sound from the main house made them both turn. The screen door slammed. Aunt Sarah, probably calling for Lucy to come wash up for dinner. The paint took a step back from the fence, and Lucy saw something in his expression shift. It was subtle, but it reminded her of the look her father got when he was steeling himself for some unpleasant task. I'll try, Lucy promised, not fully understanding what she was promising. I'll look in Grandpa's room. But I need you to promise me something too. Don't fight them tomorrow. Don't give them any reason to hurt you. I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to stop them. The paint held her gaze for one more long moment. Then he turned and walked back across the paddock, moving with a grace that seemed almost ceremonial. He stopped at his usual spot against the far fence and resumed his vigil toward the mountains, as if their entire interaction had never happened. Lucy Elizabeth Miller. Aunt Sarah's voice carried across the ranch, sharp with worry. Where are you, child? Lucy took one last look at the paint, committing every detail to memory in case this was the last time she saw him. Then she turned and ran toward the house, her mind already working on how to get into her grandfather's locked study. Behind her, unnoticed by anyone, a murder of crows settled into the cottonwood tree that shaded the North Paddock. They sat in perfect silence, watching the paint with their glittering black eyes, like an audience waiting for a play to begin. Dinner was pot roast with potatoes and carrots, one of Aunt Sarah's specialties, but Lucy could barely taste it. She pushed food around her plate while her father and aunt discussed ranch business, feed costs, cattle prices, the irrigation system that needed repairs. The chair at the head of the table remained empty, as it had for the past 2 years. Her grandfather's chair. Chuck, Aunt Sarah was saying, refilling his coffee cup. Are you sure about tomorrow? Maybe we could. It's done, Sarah. Her father's voice had that flat quality it got when he'd made up his mind about something. The buyers will be here at 8. The paint goes to Great Falls. But Daddy, Lucy started. No. He didn't raise his voice, but the single word carried enough finality to silence the whole table. Lucy, I know you've got some kind of soft spot for that horse, but this is a working ranch, not a sanctuary for animals we can't use. That paint is dangerous, he's costing us money, and tomorrow he's gone. End of discussion. Lucy stared at her plate, her throat tight. Her father was a good man. She knew that. He worked until his hands bled. He'd never missed one of her school events. And sometimes late at night, she could hear him crying in his bedroom when he thought she was asleep. But he saw the world in terms of practical problems and practical solutions. A horse that couldn't be ridden was a problem, and selling it was the solution. He wouldn't understand about the paint's eyes, about the way the horse had looked at Grandpa's window, about the feeling in Lucy's gut that screamed this was wrong. After dinner, she helped Aunt Sarah with the dishes while her father disappeared into his office to do paperwork. Through the kitchen window, Lucy could see the glow of lights from the bunkhouse where Sam and the other hands lived. She wondered if Sam was looking out toward the North Paddock, if he was thinking about what he'd said about spirits and curses. Aunt Sarah? Lucy ventured, drawing a plate. Did Grandpa Phil ever talk to you about the paint? Her aunt paused, her hands in the soapy water. Your grandfather loved that horse, she said quietly. Wouldn't hear a word against him, even after the Morrison incident. Used to spend hours out by that paddock, just watching. Your father thought he was going soft in his old age, but I don't know. Phil always was different after that winter he spent in the mountains. Never talked much about what happened up there. What winter? Before you were born, honey. Way before. He'd been up in the Beartooths checking on some cattle, got caught in a freak blizzard. Was gone for 3 weeks. We all thought he was dead. Aunt Sarah's expression grew distant. When he finally came home, he was different. Quieter. Said he'd been rescued by someone, but he wouldn't say who. Then about 6 months later, that paint showed up on our doorstep. Well, He was just a colt then. Phil took one look at him and said, he stays. Wouldn't explain why. Lucy's heart began to beat faster. Did Grandpa ever write anything down about it? Like a diary or letters? Oh, I'm sure he did. Your grandfather was always scribbling in those old notebooks of his. But they're all packed away in his study. And your father? She trailed off, but Lucy understood. Her father couldn't bring himself to sort through his dad's things yet. The grief was still too raw. Aunt Sarah, Lucy said carefully, where does Daddy keep the key to Grandpa's study? Her aunt turned, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Lucy Miller, what are you planning? Nothing bad, I promise. I think there might be something in there that could help the paint. Something Grandpa wanted us to know. Aunt Sarah studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Your father keeps his keys on his belt, honey. And before you get any ideas, that belt doesn't come off until he goes to bed, and he's a light sleeper. Lucy's heart sank, but Aunt Sarah wasn't finished. However, she continued, drying her hands on her apron, I happen to know that your grandfather kept a spare key to that study in a very specific place. He showed it to me once, made me promise to use it if anything ever happened to him, and Chuck couldn't handle going through his things. Where? Lucy whispered. Aunt Sarah moved to the kitchen's corner cabinet, the one where they kept serving platters and other rarely used items. She reached up to the very top shelf and pulled down a ceramic rooster, the kind that was supposed to be decorative, but mostly just collected dust. Taped to its bottom was a small brass key. I never used it, Aunt Sarah said quietly, pressing the key into Lucy's palm. Thought about it 100 times, but it never felt right. But if Phil wanted someone to find something in there, I think he'd want it to be you. You're more like him than your father ever was. Lucy threw her arms around her aunt's waist, squeezing tight. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If your father finds out, we're both in trouble. Aunt Sarah patted her head. Now, I'm going to finish these dishes very slowly and very loudly. And I'm going to assume you're upstairs doing your homework. And I'm definitely not going to notice if you're actually doing something else entirely. Lucy didn't need to be told twice. She crept through the living room, where her father was hunched over ledgers, his reading glasses perched on his nose. The stairs creaked on the 4th and 7th steps. She'd memorized which ones years ago, so she avoided them, pressing close to the banister where the wood was more solid. Her grandfather's study was at the end of the upstairs hallway, past her bedroom and her father's, past the bathroom with the constantly dripping faucet. The door was simple pine, same as all the others, but it felt different somehow. Heavier. More final. Lucy fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet hallway. She glanced back toward the stairs, hearing the murmur of the television from her father's office, then pushed the door open and slipped inside. The study smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco, since she remembered from sitting on her grandfather's lap while he read to her from books about cowboys and Indians, about the old days when Montana was still wild. Moonlight filtered through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The room was exactly as he'd left it. His desk stood against one wall, papers still scattered across its surface. Bookshelves lined 2 other walls, crammed with everything from veterinary manuals to Louis L'Amour novels. A gun cabinet held his old Winchester and the Remington he'd taught her to shoot with. And there, on the wall above his reading chair, was the photograph. Lucy had seen it before, years ago, but she'd forgotten about it. In the picture, a much younger Phil Miller, probably only 25 or 30, stood next to a corral, his arm draped over the neck of a small paint colt. Both man and horse were looking at the camera, but there was something in their expressions, some shared understanding that went beyond words. She walked to the desk, running her fingers over the papers. Bills, notes about cattle breeding, a half-finished letter to someone named Elias. That name tickled something in her memory, but she couldn't place it. The paint had looked at this window. Deliberately, unmistakably, he had told her to come here. But why? What was she supposed to find? Lucy knelt beside the desk, checking the drawers. Most contained mundane items, pins, stamps, old receipts. The bottom drawer was locked, but the lock was flimsy. She used a letter opener from the desk and popped it open with minimal effort. Inside were more notebooks, similar to the one she'd seen her grandfather writing in. She pulled them out, flipping through pages of observations about weather patterns, cattle health, feed calculations. Nothing unusual. Nothing about the paint or winters in the mountains or mysterious rescues. Frustrated, Lucy sat back on her heels. The floorboard beneath her shifted slightly. She froze. Then, carefully, she pressed down on the board. It moved, just a fraction of an inch, but it definitely moved. Her heart racing, Lucy wedged the letter opener into the gap and pried up the board. Beneath it, nestled in the space between the floor joists, was a metal box. It was the size of a large tackle box, made of tin that had oxidized to a mottled blue-gray. Lucy lifted it out with trembling hands and set it on the desk. The box wasn't locked, but the lid was stuck. She worked it back and forth until it finally popped open with a sound like a gunshot. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 items: a photograph, a bundle of letters tied with string, and a leather journal. The photograph was a Polaroid, its colors faded to pastels. It showed her grandfather, even younger than in the picture on the wall, sitting next to a campfire. Next to him was a man Lucy didn't recognize, dark-skinned, elderly, with long hair streaked with gray and eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera into the viewer's soul. Both men were smiling, and between them, warming himself by the fire, was a tiny paint foal that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Lucy flipped the photo over. On the back, in her grandfather's handwriting, were just 4 words and a date: Elias, Phil, and Promise. 1998. Her hands were shaking now as she unfolded the first letter. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind people used for important documents. The handwriting was her grandfather's, but looser than his later years, younger somehow. The date at the top read, December 15th, 1997. To whoever finds this, probably Chuck, if I'm being honest, though I hope I get the chance to explain this to him myself. I'm writing this because what happened to me in the Beartooths needs to be documented, and because I made a promise that I need someone else to know about in case I can't keep it. 3 weeks ago, I went up to check on the North pasture cattle before the big snow hit. I should have been back in 3 days. Instead, I got caught in the worst blizzard I've ever seen. My horse went down a ravine, broke his leg. I had to put him down. I fell trying to find shelter, broke my own leg in the process. I thought I was dead. Should have been dead. But I wasn't. Because Elias found me. Lucy's eyes flew over the words, her breath coming faster. She continued reading. Elias was a medicine man from the Crow tribe. Found me half frozen in a snowbank, dragged me to his cabin, set my leg, kept me alive. We spent 2 weeks together while the snow kept coming and my leg healed enough to travel. He told me stories about his people, about the land, about spirits and the spaces between the living and the dead. He told me he was dying. Cancer, he said, though he didn't seem too worried about it. Said he'd lived a good life, seen his great-grandchildren grow, taught what needed to be taught. But he had one regret. There was still work to do, a guardian's duty that he couldn't finish. The land needed protecting, he said, from developers and mining companies that were starting to eye the Beartooths. He'd made a promise to watch over this place, and his time was running out. Then he told me something that I still don't entirely believe, even though I saw it with my own eyes. He said when his body failed, his spirit wouldn't pass on. Not yet. He'd found a way, an old way, a forbidden way, he called it, to transfer his essence into a new vessel. Something that could move across the land he'd sworn to protect. Something that could live for years while his work was done. He needed a horse. Lucy's hands trembled so badly, she almost dropped the letter. She forced herself to keep reading. Not just any horse, he explained. It had to be a voluntary exchange. The horse had to accept his spirit, had to understand what it was agreeing to. And it had to be born at the exact moment of his passing. The doorway between worlds only opened then. I thought he was delirious. Told him so. He just smiled and said I'd see. 2 days later, Elias's mare went into labor. Difficult birth, breech position. I helped him deliver the foal, a paint colt, strong and healthy. Elias held that newborn in his arms and spoke to it in Crow, words I didn't understand but felt in my bones. And the colt looked at him with understanding. Then Elias looked at me. Take care of him, Phil, he said. Promise me you'll take care of him. Treat him with the respect due an elder. Never force him into anything he doesn't choose. He'll seem like a normal horse to most people, but you'll know. You'll see it in his eyes. An hour later, Elias died. Peaceful, like falling asleep. And in the same moment, I watched that paint colt, barely an hour old, struggled to his feet, and walked to the cabin window, looking out at the mountains exactly the way Elias had done 1,000 times. I kept my promise. I brought the paint home. He's been here for 7 years now, and I've kept him safe, kept him from being broken to saddle like he's just another ranch horse. Chuck thinks I'm sentimental about a horse I bought from some Native American breeder. He doesn't know the truth. But someone needs to know. Because I'm getting older, and if something happens to me, that paint needs to be protected. He's not dangerous. He's never been dangerous. He's just an old soul trying to finish what he started. The land he's watching over extends from our north property line all the way into the national forest. As long as he's here, as long as he's watching, it stays safe. If you're reading this, I'm probably gone. Please, whoever you are, don't let them take him to slaughter. Don't let them break him. Just let him live out his years here, doing what he was meant to do. And if he ever seems like he's ready to move on, ready to finally rest, you'll know. He'll lay down facing the mountains, and he won't get up. When that happens, bury him on the hill overlooking the north pasture. Let him rest where he can still see the land he protected. This probably all sounds crazy. Hell, it sounds crazy to me, and I lived through it. But I saw what I saw, and I made a promise to a good man who saved my life. Take care of him. His name is Elias, though everyone just calls him the Paint, or the Drifter. But his name is Elias, and he deserves better than what I'm afraid he's going to get after I'm gone. Phil Miller. Lucy sat in the moonlit study, the letter clutched in her hands, tears streaming down her face. Everything made sense now. The Paint's intelligent eyes, the way he stood like a sentinel watching the mountains, Sam's strange reaction to him. The reason her grandfather had protected him so fiercely. The Paint wasn't cursed. He wasn't dangerous. He was trying to keep a promise. And in less than 8 hours, her father was going to sell him to a meat processing plant. Lucy carefully folded the letter and put it back in the box with the photograph. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, how to convince her father. He was a practical man. But this was too far beyond practical. This was spiritual, mystical, impossible. But the Paint had known. He'd guided her here, known that she would find her grandfather's confession. He'd been waiting for someone to understand. I'm going to stop them, Lucy whispered to the empty room, to her grandfather's ghost, to whatever part of Elias might be listening. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to stop them. Outside, in the North Paddock, the Paint lifted his head toward the window where a small silhouette was backlit by the moon. If horses could smile, he might have been smiling. The crows in the cottonwood tree took flight all at once, a black cloud against the stars, their cries echoing across the Montana night like laughter or warnings or prayers. Lucy didn't sleep. She sat on her bed, the letter and photograph hidden under her pillow, watching the darkness outside her window gradually fade to gray. She tried to think of a plan, but every scenario she imagined ended the same way. Her father dismissing her story as childish fantasy, the buyers loading the Paint anyway, her being powerless to stop them. At 6:30 a.m., she heard her father's boots on the stairs. At 7 o'clock, she smelled coffee and bacon, Aunt Sarah making a big breakfast, probably her way of dealing with guilt. At 7:30, Lucy heard the distant rumble of a diesel engine growing closer. They were early. Lucy jumped off her bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes because she'd never changed. She grabbed the letter and photograph and ran downstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. Her father was on the front porch, coffee cup in hand, watching a large pickup truck tow a livestock trailer up the long gravel driveway. The truck was a beaten-up Dodge Ram, the trailer marked with the logo of Great Falls Processing, quality meat products since 1967. Daddy, wait. Lucy burst through the screen door. Chuck Miller turned, his expression already weary. Lucy, not now. Go back inside. No. You have to listen to me. She thrust the letter at him. Grandpa wrote this. It's about the Paint. His real name is Elias, and Lucy Elizabeth, I don't have time for stories. Her father didn't even look at the letter. This is hard enough without you making a scene. The truck pulled to a stop near the main barn, and 2 men climbed out. They were exactly what Lucy expected meat buyers to look like, weathered, hard-eyed, wearing clothes that had seen too many livestock auctions. The older one, probably in his 50s, had a cattle prod hanging from his belt. Morning, he called out, approaching the porch. You Miller? We're here for the Paint horse. He's in the North Paddock, Chuck said, stepping down from the porch. I'll help you load him. Fair warning, he's not friendly. We've handled worse, the younger buyer said with a grin that made Lucy's stomach turn. Difficult ones actually bring a better price. Meat's got more flavor when they've lived hard. Lucy felt something crack inside her chest. Without thinking, she leaped off the porch and ran toward the North Paddock, her father's shouts following her. The paint was standing at the fence line, exactly where he'd been the previous evening. When he saw Lucy running toward him, his ears pricked forward. "Don't let them take you," Lucy shouted, reaching the fence and climbing over it before anyone could stop her. "Run? Please, just run away." But the paint didn't run. He walked toward her with that same calm, deliberate gait, as if he'd been expecting this moment. Behind her, Lucy heard boots pounding on the hard-packed dirt. Her father was coming, and the buyers, and probably Sam from the bunkhouse. But she didn't care. She wrapped her arms around the paint's strong neck, feeling his warmth, his heartbeat against her cheek. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't let them win." The paint lowered his head, his muzzle touching her shoulder in what felt like a benediction. Then he did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. He turned to face the approaching men and let out a sound that wasn't quite a whinny or a neigh. It was deeper, older, like the call of something that predated horses entirely. The sound rolled across the paddock, across the ranch, seeming to echo off the distant mountains themselves. And the world responded. From the cottonwood tree, the murder of crows launched into the air, their cries adding to the paint's call. From the forests at the edge of the property, a pack of coyotes began to howl. The ranch's other horses, the geldings in the main paddock, the mares in the south pasture, all stopped what they were doing and turned to face the North Paddock, perfectly still, perfectly silent, like a congregation witnessing something sacred. The buyers had stopped 20 feet away, their faces suddenly uncertain. Even Chuck Miller had frozen, his mouth slightly open. "What the hell?" the older buyer muttered. It was old Sam who broke the silence. He'd come from the bunkhouse at a run, but now he stood at the paddock fence, his weathered face streaming with tears. "Uncle," he said, his voice breaking. "Uncle, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't protect you better." Lucy's father turned to stare at Sam. "What did you just say?" But Sam wasn't looking at Chuck. He was looking at the paint, at Elias, and his expression held decades of guilt and grief. "I recognized you," he said, climbing over the fence despite his age, despite his bad knee. "The day they brought you here, I recognized you. Saw it in your eyes, my mother's brother, the medicine man who taught me our stories. But I didn't say anything. Was afraid people would think I was crazy, or worse, that they'd try to break you, treat you like just another horse." He reached the paint and Lucy, dropping to his knees in the dust. "So I spread rumors instead. Made everyone scared of you. Said you were cursed. Said you brought bad luck. Thought if I made them afraid, they'd leave you alone. But all I did was make you more lonely. I'm sorry, Uncle. I'm so sorry." The paint, Elias, stepped closer to Sam and lowered his head, pressing his forehead against the old cowboy's chest. Sam wrapped his arms around the horse's neck and sobbed like a child. Lucy's father was the color of old paper. "Sam, what are you? That's impossible. Horses don't." "Read the letter, Daddy," Lucy said quietly, holding it out again. "Grandpa Phil wrote it all down. The paint isn't just a horse. His name is Elias, and he's been watching over our land for 7 years. He was Sam's uncle. He saved Grandpa's life, and you were going to send him to be turned into dog food." Chuck Miller took the letter with shaking hands. As he read, Lucy watched the color drain even further from his face. Behind him, the buyers were backing toward their truck, clearly unnerved by the crying cowboy, the crying little girl, the horse that had called to the wild things, and the dozens of animals still standing in perfect silence like witnesses. "This is insane," Chuck whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Is it?" Lucy challenged. "Look at him, Daddy. Really look at him. Don't you see it? Don't you see Grandpa Phil's friend looking back at you?" Chuck lifted his eyes from the letter to the paint. For a long moment, man and horse studied each other. Lucy held her breath. Then Chuck Miller did something Lucy had never seen him do. He climbed over the fence, walked across the paddock, and knelt in the dust next to Sam and Lucy and Elias. He reached out one calloused hand and touched the paint's face with a gentleness she'd never imagined he possessed. "I'm sorry," her father whispered. "I'm sorry, old-timer. I didn't know. I didn't understand." The paint huffed softly, as if to say he forgave them, had always forgiven them, had been waiting patiently for this moment when the truth would finally set them all free. Behind them, the older buyer cleared his throat nervously. So, I'm guessing the deal's off. Chuck stood up, and when he turned to face the buyers, Lucy saw her father's spine straighten, saw the Montana rancher replace the grieving son. The horse isn't for sale. Never should have been. You can turn that trailer around and head back to Great Falls. We drove 2 hours. And I'm sorry for wasting your time. Send me a bill for gas and your trouble. But that paint stays here. The buyers didn't need to be told twice. They climbed back into their truck, and within minutes, the sound of their diesel engine was fading down the driveway. As the dust settled, Lucy looked around at the strange scene they made. Her father, Sam, herself, all kneeling in the dirt with a horse that was so much more than a horse. The crows had returned to their tree. The coyotes had gone silent. The other horses had returned to grazing. But something fundamental had shifted. A truth had been spoken that couldn't be unspoken. Sam, Chuck said finally, his voice rough. Tell me about him. About Elias. The real Elias. And there, in the morning sun of a Montana summer day, old Sam began to tell stories. About his uncle, the medicine man. About the old ways and the sacred duty to protect the land. About how Elias had loved these mountains more than anything. How he dedicated his life to being their guardian. Lucy sat in the dust, her hand resting on the paint's shoulder, and listened. The horse stood perfectly still, as if he too was listening to the story of his own life, his own sacrifice, his own impossible promise. The days that followed felt like watching a wound slowly heal. Chuck Miller, with the determined thoroughness he brought to everything, set about making amends. The first thing he did was tear down the weathered fencing of the North Paddock. If you're going to watch over this land, he said to Elias, speaking directly to the paint in a way that would have seemed absurd to him 2 days ago, you shouldn't have to do it from behind broken-down fences. With Sam's help, and occasionally Lucy's, handing them tools, holding boards steady, they rebuilt the paddock with sturdy new posts and smooth rails. But they also added something that hadn't been there before, a gate that was never locked, never even closed all the way. Elias could come and go as he pleased now, could wander across the ranch, could stand on the high hill and look out over the Beartooths without barriers. He probably could have jumped that old fence any time he wanted, Lucy said, watching the paint explore his new freedom. Probably, Sam agreed. But he stayed anyway, because he gave his word. The more Sam talked about his uncle, and he talked a lot now, as if 20 years of silence had built up a dam that was finally breaking, the more Lucy understood. Elias had been a healer, a teacher, a man who believed the land and its people were bound together by threads of responsibility and respect. When the mining companies had started eyeing the pristine forests and valleys, when developers had begun drawing up plans for vacation homes and ski resorts, Elias had seen it as a betrayal of the sacred trust between humans and nature. He couldn't stop them all, Sam explained, sitting on the porch one evening while Elias grazed nearby. One man can't fight corporations with lawyers and money, but he could bear witness. He could watch. And there's power in that, in being seen, in knowing someone's paying attention. Has it worked? Chuck asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Have they stayed away? Sam nodded slowly. 2 companies went bankrupt before they could break ground. One had their permits mysteriously revoked. Another backed out after their lead surveyor died in an accident, fell off a cliff he'd climbed 100 times before. He paused. Could all be coincidence. Could be something else. Uncle Elias always said the land takes care of those who take care of it. Lucy thought about Jake Morrison, the horse trainer who dropped dead trying to break Elias to saddle. At the time, it had seemed like a curse. Now she understood it differently. Maybe it had been a heart attack, nothing more. Or maybe the land itself had reacted to someone trying to force its guardian into submission. Either way, it was clear that Elias wasn't meant to be ridden, wasn't meant to serve human purposes beyond the one purpose he'd chosen for himself. Aunt Sarah took to leaving apples and carrots on the porch railing, small offerings that Elias would accept with grave dignity. Never thought I'd be making peace offerings to a horse, she muttered. But Lucy noticed she always paused to stroke his neck, to whisper a quiet thank you. The other ranch hands were told the truth, or at least, a version of it that didn't sound completely insane. Chuck explained that the paint had belonged to a Native American medicine man, that he'd been given to Phil Miller with specific instructions about how to care for him, and that those instructions hadn't been followed after Phil's death. Nobody had to believe in spirits or reincarnation or impossible promises. They just had to understand that this particular horse was special, was protected, and was to be treated with respect. Most of them seemed relieved. The dark stories about curses had never sat quite right with men who spent their lives working with animals. The new story, that the paint was a kind of living memorial, a trust that needed to be honored, made more sense to their practical minds. Only young Tommy Barnes asked the question everyone was probably thinking. So, is he actually, haunted? Sam fixed him with a long look. If treating him with respect keeps your truck from breaking down and your horse from going lame, does it matter why? Tommy didn't ask again. Lucy fell into a routine. Every morning before breakfast, she'd go out to wherever Elias had spent the night. Sometimes the rebuilt paddock, sometimes the hill, once memorably on the front porch where he'd scared Aunt Sarah half to death, and she'd tell him about her day ahead. Every evening, she'd find him again and tell him about what had actually happened. She told him about school starting up again, about her teacher Mrs. Henderson who smelled like chalk and peppermint, about the math test she'd aced, and the history project on Montana pioneers she was dreading. She told him about the girls who'd made fun of her boots until she'd invited them to the ranch and let them try barrel racing. She told him about missing her mother, about the photographs she kept by her bed, about dreams she had where Mom was still alive and they were all sitting at the dinner table together. And Elias listened, really listened, with an attention that most humans couldn't manage. Sometimes he'd nuzzle her shoulder. Sometimes he'd just stand close, his warmth a comfort against the cooling autumn air. Once, when she was crying about a particularly bad day, he'd pressed his forehead against hers in a gesture so tender, so deliberately human, that it made her cry harder. "Do you miss it?" she asked him one evening, sitting on the fence rail while he grazed nearby. "Being able to talk with words, I mean. Using your hands. All the things people can do that horses can't." Elias lifted his head, a long strand of grass hanging from his mouth. His dark eyes met hers with that impossible intelligence, that awareness that sent shivers down her spine even now. "I guess it doesn't matter," Lucy continued, answering her own question. "You chose this. You chose to keep watching over the mountains, even if it meant giving up everything else. That's pretty brave." The paint walked over and lowered his head so she could scratch behind his ears, the way she'd learned he liked. In the distance, the Beartooth Mountains turned pink and gold with the setting sun, and the wind carried the scent of pine and sage and the promise of winter. Chuck Miller came out of the barn, saw his daughter and the paint silhouetted against the sunset, and felt something in his chest that might have been peace. His father had tried to tell him, in his own way, that some things mattered more than profit margins and practical decisions. It had taken losing almost everything and finding a letter hidden under a floorboard to finally understand. He walked over and climbed up to sit next to Lucy on the fence. Elias didn't move away, just stood there between them, letting them both rest their hands on his strong neck. "Your grandfather would be proud," Chuck said quietly, "of you finding that letter, of Sam finally telling the truth, of all of it. Do you think Grandpa Phil can see us?" Lucy asked. From wherever he is?" "I don't know much about spirits and souls and all that," Chuck admitted. "But if there's something after, if there's a way to look back on the people you loved, yeah, I think he's watching. Probably laughing at how long it took us to figure it out." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun finished setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and deep blue. The first stars began to appear, the same stars that had watched over this land for millennia, long before ranches or fences or promises made by dying medicine men. Old Sam emerged from the bunkhouse and walked over to join them, moving with the stiffness of a man whose body was starting to betray him, but whose spirit remained stubbornly strong. He leaned against the fence, not speaking, just being present. "Uncle," he said finally, using the word openly now, without shame or fear. "The boy from Fish and Wildlife came by today. Said there's talk of expanding the national forest protections, buying up some of the private land around here for conservation. Said it would be the biggest wilderness expansion in Montana in 30 years. Elias's ears pricked forward. "Course, Miller Creek Ranch is exempt," Sam continued. "But everything from our north property line to the park boundary would be protected. No mining, no development, no vacation condos. Just mountains and forests and streams, the way they're supposed to be. Did he say why the sudden interest? Chuck asked. Sam shrugged. Said something about environmental groups pushing for it, about public pressure, about studies showing the ecosystem was more fragile than they thought. But between you and me, he looked at Elias. I think the land's been making its case all along. Just took people a while to listen. Lucy thought about her grandfather's letter, about Elias choosing to become a guardian, about 7 years of patient watching. How much of what had happened, the bankruptcies, the permit problems, the accidents, had been coincidence? How much had been something else, something that existed in the space between the logical and the mystical? Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was that the protection was happening, that the promise was being kept, that the mountains would remain wild. How long? Lucy asked suddenly. Sam, how long is he supposed to do this? When does he get to rest? Sam was quiet for a long moment. Uncle Elias told me once, before he got sick, that some promises don't have expiration dates. You keep them until the work is done, or until you can't anymore. He reached out and stroked the paint's face with surprising gentleness. But he also said that all guardians eventually pass on their duty. Maybe when the protections are official, when the land is truly safe, maybe then. He didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. Elias wouldn't live forever. Already, Lucy could see the gray hairs around his muzzle, the slight stiffness in his gait on cold mornings. He was getting old, even for a horse. Even for a spirit wearing a horse's body. We'll make sure he's comfortable, Chuck said firmly. For however long he needs. This is his home, and it'll stay his home. As if in response, Elias lifted his head toward the mountains, still visible as dark shapes against the starlit sky. He made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and then returned his attention to the 3 humans who'd finally understood what he was. That night, Lucy dreamed of her grandfather. He was standing on the hill overlooking the north pasture, young again, healthy again, smiling in the way he used to before illness and age had worn him down. Next to him stood a tall man with long gray-streaked hair and a face marked by wisdom and laughter, Elias in his original form. She somehow knew Elias as he'd been before the choice. You did good, little Lucy, her grandfather said, and though it was a dream, his voice sounded as real as if he was standing next to her. You kept the promise alive. The dream. Elias nodded, his dark eyes the same as the paint's eyes, the same as the eyes Lucy looked into every day. The mountains are grateful, he said. The wild things are grateful. And I am grateful for being remembered, for being seen, for being allowed to finish what I started. Is it almost finished? Lucy asked. Are you almost done? Both men smiled. Not yet, her grandfather said. But soon. And when it is, we'll all be waiting for him. Your grandmother, me, all the old ones who've loved this land. He won't be alone. Lucy woke with tears on her cheeks, but peace in her heart. Outside her window, she could see the paint's silhouette on the hill, standing like a sentinel under the vast Montana sky, watching over the land he'd promised to protect. Winter came early that year, October snow dusting the mountains white and sending the temperature plunging. Chuck moved Elias into the barn on the coldest nights, but more often than not, he'd find the paint back outside by morning, standing on the hill facing the Beartooths, frost glittering in his mane like diamond dust. He's not going to change now, Sam said, shaking his head with fond exasperation. Uncle Elias was always stubborn. Rain, shine, or blizzard. If there was watching to be done, he'd be out doing it. But Lucy noticed things the others might have missed. The way Elias moved a little slower each day. The way he spent more time lying down, resting in the sun. The way his eyes, still intelligent, still aware, had developed a distant quality, as if he was looking at something beyond what anyone else could see. In November, the official announcement came. The federal government would be purchasing 150,000 acres of private land surrounding the Beartooth Absaroka Wilderness, creating one of the largest protected wilderness areas in the continental United States. The mining permits that had been in limbo for years were permanently revoked. The development plans were abandoned. The mountains and forests and streams would remain untouched, preserved for future generations. Sam brought the newspaper article out to the hill where Elias stood watching the sunrise. You did it, Uncle, he said quietly, showing the paint the headline, even though he knew horses couldn't read. It's protected now. All of it. They can't touch it. Elias lowered his head and touched his muzzle to the newspaper, as if he was reading it with senses beyond sight. Then he looked at Sam with such clarity, such profound recognition, that the old cowboy had to look away to hide his tears. "I know," Sam whispered. "I know you're tired. I know you've been waiting." That night was the first time Elias didn't come to the fence when Lucy called him. She found him lying down on the hill, his legs tucked under him, his head still facing the mountains. Her heart leaped into her throat. "Elias." She ran up the hill, her breath misting in the cold air. "Elias, are you okay?" The paint turned his head and made a soft sound, almost like a reassurance. He wasn't in distress, she realized. He was just resting. But there was something final about the way he'd positioned himself, something that spoke of a long journey coming to an end. Lucy sat down next to him, ignoring the frozen ground, and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Is it time?" she asked. "Are you ready to go?" Elias huffed softly, his breath warm against her cheek. "It's okay," Lucy said, though tears were streaming down her face. "You kept your promise. You did everything you said you would. The mountains are safe. You can rest now." She sat with him as the sun set, painting the beartooths in shades of pink and gold and purple. One by one, the others came. Her father, Aunt Sarah, Sam, even the ranch hands who'd learned to respect the paint even if they didn't fully understand him. They formed a silent circle around Elias, paying their respects to a guardian whose duty was done. As the first stars appeared, Sam began to sing. It was a song in the Crow language, one Lucy didn't understand but felt in her bones. It was a song about journeys and homecomings, about promises kept and spirits set free, about the sacred bond between the land and those who loved it enough to sacrifice everything. The crows came then, dozens of them, settling in the nearby trees in absolute silence. A pack of coyotes appeared at the edge of the tree line, sitting like dogs, their eyes reflecting the starlight. An elk, a massive bull that should have been bedded down for the night, stood at the base of the hill, his antlered head held high. The wild things had come to say goodbye. Lucy felt Elias's breathing slow, felt his body relax against hers. His eyes were fixed on the mountains, on the land he'd watched over for 7 impossible years, and there was peace in his gaze, satisfaction in finally being released from his duty. "Thank you," Lucy whispered. "Thank you for saving Grandpa Phil. Thank you for protecting the mountains. Thank you for teaching us what really matters." Elias made one last soft sound, almost like a sigh. Then his breathing stopped, his body stilled, and Lucy felt something pass through her. Not a wind, exactly, but a presence, warm and ancient and achingly kind. It moved through all of them standing on that hill, a benediction, a goodbye, a promise that even in death, the guardian's love for the land would remain. The wild things departed silently, melting back into the forest as if they'd never been there. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. And on the hill above Miller Creek Ranch, surrounded by people who had finally learned to see, an old paint horse began his final journey home. They buried him the next morning on the hill, exactly where he'd chosen to lie down. Sam led the ceremony, speaking in both Crow and English, honoring both the horse and the man whose spirit had inhabited him. They placed Phil Miller's letter in the grave too, a testament to the promise that had bound them all together. Chuck Miller carved a headstone from native Montana granite. It was simple, bearing only a name and 2 dates. Elias, guardian of the Beartooths, 1972 to 2005. Promise kept. The second date was the date of the paint's birth, Sam had explained. Elias, the medicine man, had died the same day the paint had been born, his spirit passing seamlessly from one form to another. Now, 33 years later, both man and horse could finally rest. Life at Miller Creek Ranch continued, but changed in subtle ways. Chuck never again made a decision about the land without asking himself what Elias would have thought. Sam taught Lucy the stories of his people, the old ways of respecting and protecting the wild places. Aunt Sarah hung the photograph of Phil and Elias by the fireplace, a reminder of the extraordinary bond between 2 men who'd saved each other's lives. And Lucy, growing up under the vast Montana sky, learned the most important lesson of all, that love takes many forms, that promises matter more than convenience, and that some guardians watch over us in ways we can never fully understand but must always honor. Spring came, and wildflowers bloomed around Elias's grave. Eagles nested in the cottonwood tree. Deer grazed fearlessly near the ranch buildings. It was as if the land itself had relaxed, knowing its guardian's promise had been kept, knowing the next generation understood what needed to be protected. On warm evenings, Lucy would climb the hill and sit by the headstone, talking to Elias the way she used to when he was alive. She told him about school, about the ranch, about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian so she could help animals the way he'd helped preserve their wild home. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, when the mountains turned golden in the setting sun, Lucy swore she could feel something, a warmth, a presence, a gentle acknowledgement that he was listening still, that some guardians never truly leave the places they loved. The paint was gone, but the promise remained. And in the Beartooth Mountains, wild and free and forever protected, the spirit of a medicine man who had loved them enough to give up everything smiled and finally, peacefully, rested.